Hi guys, gather close for a tale that has lived in whispers, in old manuscripts, in the stained glass of forgotten chapels, and in the dreams of storytellers across the centuries. You have heard of King Arthur, of Camelot, of the Knights of the Round Table, but have you ever wondered what was myth, what was memory, and what was real? Tonight, we pull back the veils of legend, step into the smoky halls of history, and sit with the ghosts of knights who may or may not have lived, but whose stories shaped kings, poets, and entire nations. This is no ordinary tale, it is one of honor and betrayal, shining swords and shadowy truths, a story that refuses to die no matter how many centuries pass. So dim the lights, let the silence settle around you, and drift with me now into the world of the Round Table. They say that long ago, when Britain was torn by warring tribes, when Saxons pressed from the east and the old Roman walls crumbled in moss and ruin, a leader rose from the chaos. His name, if we trust the chronicles, was Arthur. To some, he was no more than a warlord clinging to fading Roman power, a man with mud on his boots and iron in his hands. To others, he was the king of kings, chosen by fate and heaven, who pulled a sword from a stone when no other could, and gathered to him the greatest warriors of the age. This is where the line between myth and reality blurs, and it is in that blur that the legend of the Round Table was born. Imagine a great hall in Camelot, its rafters high, its banners bright, and at its heart, a round table where no man sat above another. This was no accident of carpentry. It was a symbol, a declaration that knights and kings alike had an equal voice in Arthur's dream of a just kingdom. But was there truly such a table? Or was it an invention of poets and monks, eager to dress the bloody business of medieval war with the garments of nobility and honor? The answer, as so often in history, is both shadow and light. The first whispers of Arthur appear in the writings of a monk named Gildas, who in the 6th century lamented the fall of Roman Britain and the darkness that followed. He did not name Arthur, but he spoke of battles where a great leader held the line against the Saxon tide. Later, another monk, Nennius, wrote of a warrior, Arthur, who won 12 great battles, the last at Mount Badon, where the Saxons were thrown back in ruin. These accounts are bare bones, stripped of magic and chivalry, and yet they are the skeleton on which later ages draped shining armor. By the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth, a master of myth-making, gave us Arthur the king, Merlin the wizard, Guinevere the queen, and the Knights of the Round Table. His stories were copied, translated, and carried across Europe, where troubadours and poets embroidered them with romance, until reality was buried deep beneath the poetry. But let us walk into Camelot as the poets imagined it, for myth, too, holds truth of a different kind. The hall is alive with torchlight, the smell of roasted meat heavy in the air, the clash of goblets echoing against stone. Around the great round table sit knights whose names have lived for centuries: Lancelot, whose love for Queen Guinevere would shake the kingdom; Gawain, bold and sometimes reckless; Percival, innocent seeker of the Grail; Galahad, pure of heart; and many more, each a thread in the great tapestry of legend. To the medieval mind, these knights were ideals to strive toward, not flesh and blood men, but embodiments of courage, loyalty, and sometimes tragic weakness. Yet behind the glitter, one may glimpse the hard world of the Middle Ages. A knight was not simply a figure of courtesy. He was a warrior, bound by oath to serve his lord in battle. Armor was heavy, swords were sharp, and the code of chivalry often praised in poems, was not always kept in practice. To understand the Round Table is to understand both the dream of a noble order and the reality of feudal bloodshed. Consider Lancelot, perhaps the most famous of Arthur's knights. In the tales, he was unmatched in battle, a paragon of chivalry, yet undone by his love for Guinevere. Was this a mere invention? Likely, yes, for no early chronicle mentions Lancelot. He was the creation of French poets, who wove into the Arthurian cycle the themes of courtly love that fascinated their audiences. They imagined secret glances, stolen meetings, and the ruin of kingdoms by passion. The tragedy of Lancelot and Guinevere was less about history and more about the dangers of desire in a world where loyalty was paramount. And yet, in their invention, the poets revealed something universal, the fragile balance between duty and love. Then there is the Grail, that holy vessel said to be the cup of Christ, carried by Joseph of Arimathea to Britain and sought by Arthur's knights in quests filled with peril and wonder. Here, too, myth stretches beyond truth. The earliest chronicles know nothing of the Grail. It emerged later as Christian themes mingled with Celtic myth. The Grail was not simply a relic, but a mirror of spiritual yearning, a symbol of purity in a violent world. Knights like Galahad, who achieved the vision of the Grail, embodied the hope that even in the clash of swords and the shadows of betrayal, a soul might reach toward heaven. But what of reality? Archaeologists search the old hills of Britain for clues of Arthur's time. At sites like South Cadbury Castle in Somerset, traces of a great hall from the 5th or 6th century hint at a warlord who may have ruled their weapons, pottery, and fortifications suggest that amid the ruins of Roman Britain, leaders sought to hold their lands against invaders. Was one of them Arthur? The evidence is tantalizing, but never certain. History offers us fragments, while legend offers us a complete story. The question is whether we accept the fragments as enough, or embrace the legend for the meaning it carries. The Round Table itself may have roots in older traditions. In Celtic lore, kings were often surrounded by councils of warriors, their equality emphasized in ritual feasts where no man claimed precedence. The very shape of the table speaks of this: no head, no hierarchy, only a circle of equals. To medieval society, riddled with strict ranks and privileges, the idea of a round table was radical, almost utopian. That is why the legend endured was not just about knights, but about a vision of justice, where power was shared and honor bound men together. Yet dreams falter, even in legend. The Round Table did not last. The love of Lancelot and Guinevere, the ambition of Mordred, the shadow of betrayal, these cracked the circle. In the end, Camelot fell. Arthur was struck down, and he was carried to the Isle of Avalon, where some say he sleeps still, waiting to return when Britain needs him most. This ending was more than a tale. It was a lament, a recognition that no human kingdom, however noble, can escape corruption and decline. And yet, the dream lives on, precisely because it failed. We tell the story not because Arthur triumphed, but because he fell, and in his fall, we glimpse both the fragility and the beauty of human striving. Even today, the myth shapes us. Writers from Malory in the 15th century to Tennyson in the 19th, to films and novels in our own age, return to the Round Table, reshaping it for their time. For some, Arthur is a nationalist hero. For others, a tragic lover. For others still, a symbol of lost golden ages. That is, the power of myth. It does not die, but bends to the needs of each generation. And so, as we close this first part of our journey, picture the hall of Camelot once more. The torches flicker, the knights sit proud, the round table gleams beneath the glow. Outside, the night is cold, the future uncertain, but here, within these walls, legend is alive. Whether Arthur was a man of flesh and blood, or a dream woven from poetry, his story has shaped centuries, whispering of honor, love, betrayal, and hope. The Round Table is both myth and reality, both dream and memory, and in its circle, we too find a place. The Hall of Camelot breathed with life, as though it were a living thing, every stone humming with the echo of voices, every banner stirring in the air, as if the walls themselves knew that they bore witness to something greater than ordinary kingship. Knights leaned forward around the round table, their hands resting on goblets and hilts, their eyes alive with loyalty, ambition, or secret desire. Though their oaths bound them as brothers, within each heart was a private fire, and it was from those fires that the shape of Arthur's kingdom was forged. Beyond the high walls of the court, Britain itself lay divided, hills bristling with watchtowers, rivers patrolled by raiders, while far in the east, Saxon warbands tested the strength of Arthur's dream. The knights who swore to defend the land were not just names on a poet's page. They were the thin line between a fragile hope and the chaos pressing at every border. Among them sat Gawain, his laughter as loud as his temper was quick, a knight whose strength in battle was matched only by his pride. He would face any foe without fear, yet too often his boldness led him into traps of his own making. Across the table, Percival kept his silence, eyes wide, heart pure, a young knight whose innocence made him both foolish and wise. Then there was Galahad, the flower of knighthood, born without stain, whose very presence reminded the others of the impossible standards to which they were held. But always the gaze of the hall drifted toward Lancelot, greatest of them all, his skill unmatched, his loyalty unquestioned, till the day loyalty and love collided. Arthur, seated among them yet not above them, knew the weight of their eyes, the burden of their expectations. He was a man pressed between the demands of war and the ideals of peace, between the hard reality of governing and the shining dream that poets later would call Camelot. To many he was already more myth than man, a king chosen by destiny when he drew the sword Excalibur from the stone. Yet he knew in his heart that the sword alone did not make him king. It was the faith of these men, the unity of this circle, that gave him power. When word first came of the Grail, it was like a spark thrown into dry straw. Tales reached Camelot of a relic so holy that it could heal the sick, feed the hungry, and reveal the face of God. At once the knights' hearts burned to pursue it, not merely for glory, but for salvation. The Grail was not a trophy of war, it was a promise of divine grace. Arthur, wise though weary, warned them that the quest would scatter the fellowship, that few who sought the Grail would return. Yet the hunger for the holy was stronger than caution. Galahad rose with fire in his eyes, declaring that he would not rest until he beheld it. Percival, innocent and eager, followed him. Even Lancelot, though shadowed by his secret love, could not resist the pull. One by one, the knights left the round table, and the once united brotherhood fractured across the wide wilderness of Britain. Their quests were filled with marvels, for such is the nature of legend. Some faced trials of the body, dragons and dark nights, others trials of the soul, temptations of pride and despair. Galahad alone, pure as no other, reached the vision of the Grail. He beheld it with unclouded eyes, and in that moment was lifted beyond the mortal world, never to return. Percival, to glimpsed the mystery, though through trial and error, through lessons learned in humility. Lancelot, for all his strength, came near but was denied, for his heart was divided, torn between devotion to God and his earthly love for Guinevere. And when the knights straggled back to Camelot, fewer in number, wearier in spirit, the Round Table no longer shone with the same brilliance. The Grail had brought wonder, but it had also sown loss. It was in the absence left by the Grail quest that shadows crept deeper into Camelot. Guinevere, queen of the realm, had long kept her secret flame for Lancelot hidden, but fire will not remain forever in the hearth. Their glances grew longer, their meetings more daring, until whispers filled the hall. Some knights averted their eyes, unwilling to betray their queen. Others, bound by envy or loyalty, sharpened their tongues. Mordred, the dark figure in Arthur's tale, half kin and half enemy, watched with patient malice. He saw not only the weakness of men, but the weakness of kingdoms, and he waited for the moment when loyalty would crack. When at last their love was revealed, it was as though the heart of Camelot itself had been pierced. Some knights rose in Guinevere's defense, swearing that love could not undo all her good deeds. Others cried betrayal, demanding her punishment. Arthur, torn between kingly duty and human grief, knew that if he spared them, the law would be mocked. Yet, if he condemned them, the bond of fellowship would be broken beyond repair. He chose justice, and Guinevere was sentenced, though Lancelot would not let her die. In a clash that tore the brotherhood apart, Lancelot rode against his former comrades, rescuing the queen but leaving the Round Table fractured in blood. From that wound Camelot never healed. Knights who once sat as equals now chose sides, some riding with Arthur, others with Lancelot. The vision of unity that the Round Table had promised was gone, and in its place rose suspicion and war. Even those who had once sought the Grail, who had glimpsed heaven itself, found their swords turned against their brothers. Such is the tragedy of legend, that the very virtues that make heroes also sow their downfall. As the kingdom reeled, Mordred seized his chance. Whether son, nephew, or usurper, accounts differ, but all agree that he was the shadow lurking at the end of Arthur's tale. When Arthur rode to battle, Mordred struck, declaring himself king, gathering to him those weary of Arthur's dream. The final clash came at Camelot, where the green fields were trampled under hoof, and the cries of dying men drowned out the songs of poets. There Arthur and Mordred met, sword against sword, and though Mordred fell, Arthur was mortally wounded. The legends say that he was borne away to Avalon, an isle of healing, where he lies in enchanted sleep, waiting to return when his people need him most. Whether Avalon was a poet's invention, a Christian heaven in disguise, or a memory of Celtic otherworlds, it became the resting place of a king who was too great to die. For a mortal king may perish, but a legendary one must linger, a hope against despair, a promise that justice might rise again. In the centuries that followed, poets and chroniclers retold these tales, each bending them to their own time. To medieval courts, Arthur was the model of chivalry. To monks, he was a warning against pride. To nations, he was a symbol of unity. Malory, writing in a war-torn 15th century, gave us the grand tragedy of La Morte d'Arthur, where the noblest fellowship the world had seen was undone by the frailties of men. Tennyson, in the Age of Empire, saw in Arthur's fall a mirror of Britain's own anxieties. weaving the tales into the idylls of the king. Even in modern times, filmmakers and novelists return to Camelot, remaking it for new generations, for the legend is too strong to fade. Did some warlord of the 6th century rally Britain against Saxons, leaving behind only whispers that poets later transformed into myth? Archaeologists uncover hill forts, remnants of halls, fragments of swords, yet no proof strong enough to silence doubt. Perhaps that is fitting, for if Arthur were proven beyond doubt, he would be only a man. It is the uncertainty, the mist between history and legend, that makes him eternal. And so the story of the Round Table is both myth and reality. It was never just about knights in armor or kings in crowns. It was about the human yearning for justice, for unity, for a fellowship where no man sat above another. It was about love that defied law, loyalty that clashed with desire, quests that sought heaven, yet found only heartbreak. It was about the fragility of dreams, and the way even shattered dreams can inspire centuries of hope. When we picture the Round Table now, we do not see only wood and stone. We see an idea. We see a circle where every voice mattered, where every knight was equal, where men reached beyond themselves to touch something greater. That table may never have stood in Camelot, yet it stands in our imagination, a reminder of what might be. And though Arthur fell, though Camelot crumbled, the dream rides on, carried not in swords or battles, but in stories, in the hearts of those who still believe that honor, though fragile, is worth the struggle. Thus ends this part of the tale, the heart of the myth, where the dream rose and fell, where love and betrayal tore the fellowship apart, where kingship and legend blurred into one. The Round Table is gone, the knights scattered, the king borne away to Avalon, yet still we speak his name. For myths are not bound by death, and legends never truly fade. The dust of Camelot had barely settled in the telling when the story of Arthur began to change, reshaped not by those who had fought at his side, but by monks, poets, and chroniclers who sought meaning in the ruin of a king. Legends never rest on the battlefield. They grow in the mouths of storytellers, weaving themselves into memory until myth feels truer than history. After Arthur was carried to Avalon, Britain was left in fragments, yet the memory of the Round Table clung like a lantern in the dark, passed from bard to bard, manuscript to manuscript. Each generation lifted the tale and polished it until it reflected their own hopes, fears, and ideals. In this way, Arthur became not merely a man or a king, but a mirror in which the ages saw themselves. In the early centuries after his supposed reign, chroniclers spoke of him as a warrior, a leader who rallied his people against Saxon invaders. His name was invoked in monasteries as a symbol of resistance, of God's chosen champion who stood firm when others faltered. But soon the story grew beyond the bare bones of battle. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, transformed Arthur into a monarch of splendor, ruling over a court so magnificent that it rivaled the ancient Romans. He introduced Merlin, a prophet and sorcerer whose wisdom shaped the king's destiny, and he filled the halls of Camelot with knights whose names rolled like poetry from the tongue. Geoffrey's Historia, Regum Britannia, spread across Europe like wildfire, feeding the hunger of courts and troubadours for tales of noble kings and shining deeds. From France came new voices that embroidered the legend further. Detra wove the romance of Lancelot and Guinevere, setting fire to the theme of forbidden love that would dominate the Arthurian cycle. He introduced the quest for the Holy Grail, blending Christian devotion with Celtic myth, turning the knight's adventures into spiritual journeys. His verses captivated noble audiences, for they reflected the ideals of courtly love, service to one's lady as sacred as service to one's lord. In this way, Arthur's Britain was remade into a court of courtesy and passion, a dream not of warlords and fortresses, but of gallant knights and noble ladies. Yet, as the tale spread, each region bent it to its own image. In Wales, Arthur remained a warrior hero of old Celtic tradition, appearing in stories where he hunted magical beasts or wrestled with giants. In Cornwall, he became a local king whose memory lingered in stone crosses and hill forts. In Brittany, across the sea, his story mingled with local folklore, feeding the fires of identity in a land long tied to Britain. To the French poets, Arthur was less important than Lancelot or Galahad, whose personal quests spoke to the spiritual yearnings of their audiences. To the English chroniclers, Arthur was a national figure, a ruler whose glory reflected their own ambitions. Thus, the Round Table was not one circle but many, shifting in meaning depending on who sat around it. In time, the story reached its most tragic and beautiful form in Sir Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, written in the 15th century amid the Wars of the Roses. Malory, his knights were noble but flawed, striving toward ideals they could never fully attain. The fellowship of the Round Table was undone not only by love and betrayal, but by the inexorable frailty of human nature. Malory's Arthur was not only a king, but a tragic figure, striving to build a perfect realm in an imperfect world. His book, one of the first printed in England by William Caxton, ensured that Arthur's legend would endure in ink as well as song through Malory. The Arthurian myth passed into the Renaissance and beyond, carried by poets and playwrights who reshaped it to suit their art. Spenser, in The Faerie Queene, used Arthur as a symbol of virtue, embodying the chivalric ideals of Elizabethan England. Shakespeare alluded to him in histories, for Arthur had become part of the fabric of Britain's identity. Though the Renaissance prized classical antiquity, Arthur lingered as Britain's own mythology, a native epic to rival the tales of Troy and Rome. The Round Table, once a dream of equality, was transformed into a canvas upon which nations painted their ideals. But myth never rests, and in the centuries that followed, Arthur was reborn again and again. In the 19th century, Alfred Lord Tennyson lifted Malory's tales and reimagined them for a Victorian audience. His Idylls of the King clothed Arthur's story in the grandeur of empire and the anxieties of modernity. To Victorians, the fall of Camelot reflected their own fears that their empire, vast and glittering, might collapse under the weight of human weakness. The knights became symbols of morality, their quests allegories of spiritual struggle, their failures warnings of pride and passion unchecked. Arthur's death at Camelot was retold as a lament not only for a king, but for the fragility of all human endeavor. Even as poets and novelists shaped the myth, scholars and archaeologists searched for the man behind it. Excavations at Tintagel in Cornwall uncovered remnants of a settlement dating to the 6th century, fueling speculation that Arthur's birthplace lay there. At South Cadbury, traces of a great hall suggested a stronghold that might have belonged to a powerful warlord. Inscriptions and relics hinted at leaders whose deeds may have sparked the legend. Yet none of these findings could confirm the tales. They only deepened the mystery. The line between myth and history remained blurred, as though Arthur himself resisted being pinned down. Perhaps that was his greatest power, to be less a man than an idea, shifting and enduring across ages. The Round Table itself found new life in relics and rituals. At Winchester, a massive wooden table was displayed, painted with the names of knights, and presented as the very table of Arthur, though later analysis dated it to the 13th century. Long after Arthur's time, it was embraced as a symbol of continuity, a physical link to the legend. Monarchs invoked Arthur to legitimize their rule, claiming descent from him or drawing strength from his story. The Tudors, eager to unite a fractured realm, used Arthur's name to bolster their dynasty, even naming Henry VII's first son Arthur, in the hope that he would embody the legendary king. Though the boy died young, the symbolism endured, and Arthur's myth remained a political tool as well as a tale of wonder. In the modern era, Arthur's legend leaped from parchment to stage and screen, reshaped once again for new audiences. Romantic painters imagined Camelot in glowing hues, knights shining under golden skies. Novelists reinterpreted the tale, some casting Arthur as a tragic hero, others as a flawed man undone by love. In the 20th century, films brought the Round Table to life in armor and spectacle, while musicals like Camelot painted it as a dream of idealism on the brink of destruction. Each retelling emphasized different facets: chivalry, romance, tragedy, or hope, yet all drew from the same deep well of legend. Beyond art, the story seeped into everyday language. To call someone a knight in shining armor is to echo Arthur's world. To speak of a holy grail is to invoke the knight's quest for the unattainable. Even in politics, leaders have invoked Arthur's return, likening themselves to kings who would restore a golden age. The Round Table has become shorthand for equality and unity, used in councils and conferences where men and women gather as peers. The myth has transcended its medieval roots to become a living metaphor, woven into the fabric of culture. Yet, at the heart of it remains the simple power of story. Whether Arthur was a warlord or a dream, his legend endures because it speaks to something universal. We long for leaders who are just, for communities where all have a voice, for heroes who strive toward ideals even when they fall short. We recognize in Lancelot's love and betrayal the tension between duty and desire. We see in the Grail quest the human hunger for transcendence. We feel in Arthur's fall the inevitability of loss, and in his promised return the hope that loss is never the final word. These truths, cloaked in the trappings of knights and castles, remain as relevant today as in the halls of medieval courts. The reality of Arthur may never be uncovered, yet the myth is reality in another sense. It has shaped the way generations imagined kingship, loyalty, and justice. It has left marks on literature, art, politics, and language. It has inspired rebels and rulers alike, offering both a golden past to yearn for and a warning of how even the noblest dreams can be undone. Arthur may not ride again from Avalon, but in every retelling he returns. The Round Table may not stand in Camelot, but wherever people gather as equals, its circle is drawn anew. As we trace the myth through centuries, we see not only how it changed, but how it endured. The story of Arthur is not fixed in stone, but alive, breathing, shifting to reflect each age that tells it. That is why it has never faded. Kings rise and fall, empires expand and crumble, but the dream of Camelot, fragile and shining, remains. We tell the story not because it is history, but because it is human. And in the end, whether myth or reality, the round table still waits, gleaming in the torchlight of imagination, calling us to take our place among its circle. Across the centuries, the legend of Arthur has refused to remain bound to parchment or cloistered within the echoing halls of monasteries. When the medieval monks wrote of Arthur, they clothed him in Christian virtue. When French poets sang of him, they wrapped him in silk and romance. When Malory crafted his great work, he cast Camelot as a mirror for a world broken by civil war. But the tale did not end there. In the modern world, where castles crumble into ruins and knights in armor have long vanished from the battlefield, Arthur and his round table endure not as relics but as living symbols. From the rise of nations to the glow of cinema screens, from dusty classrooms to bustling political chambers, the legend has adapted and survived, shimmering like Excalibur's blade in the shifting light of history. The Victorian Age was perhaps the first great revival of Arthur after Malory, for the Victorians, standing astride the vast reach of empire, and yet shadowed by industrial unrest, the myth of Camelot offered both inspiration and warning. Tennyson's Idylls of the King painted Arthur as the noble ruler of a kingdom striving toward moral perfection, only to collapse under the weight of human weakness. It was a lesson aimed at Britain itself, that power and grandeur could not stand without virtue. The Victorians seized upon the Grail as a symbol of spiritual striving in an age of doubt, seeing in Galahad's purity a contrast to the grime of industrial cities. Painters like Edward Burne-Jones and the Pre-Raphaelites filled their canvases with luminous visions of knights, queens, and enchanted landscapes, turning Camelot into a dreamscape that offered escape from soot and smoke. Arthur was no longer merely a medieval king. He was a Victorian ideal, a reminder of values threatened by modernity. As the 19th century yielded to the 20th, Arthur's legend leaped into yet another realm: popular culture. Novels carried the tales into the hands of ordinary readers, stripped of Latin or courtly French. Illustrators brought color to Camelot, depicting Excalibur's gleam and Guinevere's sorrow in ways that could be consumed by mass audiences. Soon, Arthur was no longer the preserve of scholars and poets, but of children in classrooms, readers by firesides, dreamers in distant lands. With the spread of empire, the myth traveled carried to America, to colonies across the seas, where Arthur's name was invoked as part of a shared heritage, a link to an imagined golden past. In the 20th century, film and stage gave Camelot fresh life. Hollywood dressed Arthur in shining armor, gave Guinevere luminous eyes, and let the clash of swords ring across silver screens. Directors shaped the tale into grand spectacles or intimate dramas, each interpretation reflecting the anxieties of its age. The musical Camelot, debuting in the 1960s, turned Arthur's court into a metaphor for idealism in politics. President John F. Kennedy's administration was often likened to that Camelot, a brief, shining moment of hope and promise cut short by tragedy. Thus, the myth entwined itself with real history once more. Its echoes felt not just in story, but in the lives of nations. But Arthur has never belonged solely to kings or presidents. His legend has been reshaped endlessly, sometimes as satire, sometimes as fantasy, sometimes as historical fiction. T.H. White's The Once and Future King gave readers a thoughtful, bittersweet retelling in which Arthur struggles with the burden of leadership, wrestling with questions of justice, war, and humanity. In White's hands, the Round Table became an experiment in governance, a noble but doomed attempt to make men better than they are. It resonated in an age scarred by world wars, when the dream of perfect order seemed ever out of reach. Later, fantasy authors such as Marion Zimmer Bradley reimagined the tale from new perspectives, weaving the voices of women, druids, and forgotten figures into the tapestry. Each retelling peeled away a different layer, exposing new truths while preserving the heart of the myth. Meanwhile, scholars probed the historical roots with relentless curiosity. Excavations at Tintagel suggested a seat of power in the early medieval period, with imported pottery and evidence of trade that spoke of a kingly presence. Some scholars argued that Arthur was a composite figure, drawn from memories of several warlords who resisted the Saxons in the turbulent 5th and 6th centuries. Others suggested he was wholly myth, an invention stitched together from Celtic tales of heroes and gods. Yet the absence of certainty did not diminish the power of the story, it heightened it. For in the gap between fact and fable, imagination thrives. The historian may question Arthur's reality, but the storyteller knows that reality is not always the measure of truth. The Round Table itself became a symbol far beyond literature. Politicians invoked it when calling for unity, describing councils where all voices could be heard as round tables. International negotiations borrowed the image, promising equality among nations, even when the reality fell short. The phrase entered the language, stripped of its medieval armor, yet still carrying the weight of idealism. Thus, Arthur's dream found life not only in novels and films, but in the workings of modern society, its shape-shifting to suit the needs of diplomacy, governance, and cooperation. At the same time, the darker edges of the myth have never been forgotten. The love of Lancelot and Guinevere, the betrayal of Mordred, the fall of Camelot, these remain reminders that no dream, however noble, is free of human flaw. Modern storytellers lean into this tragedy, portraying Arthur not as an untouchable hero, but as a man bound by the same weaknesses as all others. Films and series depict him as flawed, uncertain, sometimes even corrupt, while knights, once painted as paragons, are recast with human complexity. In this way, the legend adapts to a world that distrusts perfection, preferring heroes who stumble and fail yet still strive toward light. Even in the realm of fantasy and science fiction, Arthur's shadow stretches long. Writers set the Round Table in space, reimagining knights as starfarers questing among galaxies. Others draw on Arthurian motifs to shape worlds of magic, where Excalibur shines anew in alien soil. In gaming, players don the mantle of knights, embark on Grail quests, or rule over digital Camelots, ensuring that the legend remains not only read but lived in interactive form. Arthur is no longer confined to manuscripts or stages. He is alive in pixels, in online worlds, in the imaginations of millions, who may never have opened Mallory's book, but who nonetheless feel the pull of the myth. And yet, for all the transformations, certain images endure. The sword in the stone, the circle of knights, the Isle of Avalon, the last great battle at Camelot. These images resonate because they speak to something eternal. The sword in the stone is the call to destiny, the moment when the ordinary is lifted into greatness. The Round Table is the yearning for equality, for a community where each voice is valued. The Grail is the unreachable ideal, the divine spark that drives human striving. Avalon is the hope that even in death renewal waits. And Camelot is the reminder that every dream, no matter how bright, can fall. Together, these symbols form a story, not of one time or place, but of humanity itself. Even now, scholars debate Arthur's origins, artists reinterpret his story, and ordinary people invoke his name. Perhaps the truest measure of his reality is not whether he lived in the 6th century, but whether he still lives today. For myths are not corpses preserved in books. They are living things, breathing in the cultures that tell them. Arthur is real in the same way that justice, love, and hope are real, not bound to fact, but woven into meaning. The promise of his return has never faded. Once and future king, the poets called him, suggesting that he would rise again in Britain's hour of need. This belief has flickered in moments of crisis, when nations faltered and people longed for a savior. Whether in jest or in solemn hope, the cry for Arthur's return has echoed, a reminder that some figures never truly leave. They linger in the imagination, waiting to be called forth again. And, in a sense, Arthur has returned, again and again, in every age that retells his story. Each new Camelot, whether on stage, screen, or page, is his rising. Each new circle drawn in the name of equality is the round table restored. So the tale continues, not ended at Camelot, not confined to Avalon, but living in us who remember. The knights ride on in our imaginations, their quests reworked, their battles refought, their ideals re-examined. Arthur remains both myth and reality, both dream and shadow, a king who may never have lived yet, who has never died. His story is proof that legends do not fade, they adapt, they endure, they shape, and are shaped by every generation. When we speak of the Round Table now, we do not mean merely a circle of knights in armor. We mean the dream of a just community, the hope of fellowship stronger than ambition, the belief that even in betrayal and downfall, ideals are worth the striving. The Round Table gleams in every story we tell, every council we form, every dream we refuse to abandon. And though Avalon lies shrouded in mist, though Excalibur rests beneath dark waters, the king is never gone. In every telling, in every hope, Arthur rides again, once and future, myth and reality, eternal in the human heart. Under the vaulted ceilings of a medieval court, where banners swayed and the scent of wax candles lingered in the air, the sound of laughter could cut through the tension like a blade. The jester, dressed in motley of scarlet, blue, and gold, jingled into the room, his bells chiming at every step, his painted face alive with mockery and mischief. He carried no sword, no shield, no armor of iron, but his weapon was sharper, his tongue, his wit, his ability to twist truth into humor. As nobles feasted, he pranced between tables, mocking a lord's oversized beard, turning the king's strict commands into riddles, and mimicking the walk of a proud knight so perfectly that the hall erupted into laughter. It was not merely entertainment, it was release. A moment when men who carried the burdens of politics, taxes, wars, and alliances could let loose their grip on formality. Yet beneath every joke lay danger. One word too sharp, one mockery too cruel, and the fool could pay with his life. That was the paradox of the jester's world, narred for amusement, yet never safe from the wrath of those he entertained. In another part of Europe, jongleurs wandered from town to town, carrying lutes, harps, and flutes. They sang of knights and saints, of battles fought and romances woven in legend. Where the jester belonged to the court, tied to the whims of a king, the jongleur roamed freely, spreading tales across villages and cities. They were walking storytellers, weaving news with music, stitching history into rhyme. A jongleur might perform in a bustling square at noon, juggling knives while reciting a verse, then at night find himself invited into a noble's hall, playing songs that softened the silence. Some mocked like jesters, others praised heroes, but all carried the breath of the people's voice. Their songs were not written down. They lived in memory, passed from mouth to mouth, adapting, shifting, becoming part of a shared culture that united kingdoms more than any crown could. Imagine the contrast. In the king's chamber, a fool leaping onto a table, spilling wine as he declared himself the true master of the feast, to roaring laughter, while in the market square a jongleur spun tales of Charlemagne, his voice rising above the chatter of merchants and farmers, his melody carrying through the smoke of roasting meat and the cries of hawkers. Both figures, though different, held a similar power. They brought joy, reflection, and often truth hidden behind performance. The life of a jester was both enviable and perilous. On one hand, he was close to the king, allowed to mock and jest in ways that no lord or knight dared. On the other, his very survival depended on his ability to read the mood of the court. A sharp joke on a day when the king was troubled could end in exile, imprisonment, or worse. There are stories of jesters who calmed tempers when ambassadors clashed, who turned battles into laughter, easing tensions that might have erupted into war. Some became confidants, trusted more than advisors, for they could speak the truth through laughter. Others were punished for saying aloud what everyone else only thought. The line was razor thin, and each performance was a gamble. The jongleur's gamble was different. He wandered roads that were unsafe, traveling with little more than his instrument, his voice, and his courage. He entertained peasants for bread, lords for coin, and soldiers for a place by the fire. His tales carried the flavor of the landfolk legends, stories of saints, verses that mocked lords or praised kings. He could earn applause in one town and be chased out of the next, yet their role was vital. They spread stories far and wide, making heroes out of men and myths out of events. Without the jongleur, many tales might never have survived, for parchment was rare and literacy rarer still. Their voices were the memory of the people. One jester, famed in chronicles, once dared to mock his king for losing a battle, leaping about the hall, pretending to drop his sword, tripping over his own feet, and declaring himself a great general. The king, rather than rage, burst into laughter, and the tension of defeat was broken. Another fool, less fortunate, insulted a nobleman's pride and was whipped for his words. Jongleurs, too, had their risks. Some were accused of spreading dangerous rumors or mocking the church. Others were celebrated, even knighted, for their performances, blurring the line between entertainer and noble. At feasts, the role of comedy and performance was not mere pastime, it was ritual. After hours of feasting, when bellies were heavy with food and minds clouded with wine, the jester would step forth to reawaken the hall. He danced, tumbled, balanced on chairs, and turned words into sparks of laughter. Jongleurs might be invited into the same halls, their songs turning silence into story, their melodies softening the drunken chatter. Together, these performers painted the atmosphere of medieval life, They were not knights, not kings, not bishops, but without them, the story of the court would feel empty. What made their craft so powerful was its humanity. Jesters reflected the flaws of the powerful, reminding kings that they were men. Jongleurs reflected the hopes of the common people, carrying songs of love, bravery, and loss. Their comedy was more than jest, more than laughter. It was connection, a bridge between the lofty towers of nobility and the bustling streets of the market. Even the mightiest rulers needed their words. For in laughter, truth was softened, and in song, history was preserved. And so, in the courts of Europe, as banners draped walls and torches flickered against stone, the laughter of jesters and the music of jongleurs became the heartbeat of gatherings. The fool's jingle and the minstrel's tune were reminders that amidst crowns and swords, crowns and treaties, what truly bound people together was not just power or war, but the shared joy of story, comedy, and song. In the smoky warmth of a grand hall, the laughter had died down for the moment, goblets refilled, and meats carved once more as servants darted between benches. Then the jester leaped into view again, his cap with its long ears bouncing, his bells chiming like small voices of mischief. He somersaulted across the floor, landed on one knee before the queen, and presented a roast chicken as though it were the crown jewels. The room erupted, not only at his absurdity, but at the daring sparkle in his eyes. He knew how to hold a crowd, when to push a jest, when to soften it, when to let silence stretch before delivering a punch that set the hall aflame with laughter. His body was as much his tool as his voice. His leaps, tumbles, faces, and gestures turned even simple words into performance. At times he seemed little more than a fool in colored rags, yet in truth he was a master of timing, reading moods, and knowing when to aim his mockery, high or low. His gift was not only wit but instinct, for without it he would not survive. Far away from such luxury, on a dirt road that wound between villages, a jongleur walked with his lute slung over his back, dust clinging to his boots. He had sung in a town square the night before, earning bread, cheese, and a coin or two, enough to see him along the road. As he walked, he hummed a ballad, his voice carrying the tale of Roland and his horn, of knights standing bravely at Rongsvo. These songs had traveled farther than armies, farther than kings' decrees, because they lived not on parchment but in hearts. Each jongleur added his own verse, twisted the melody, changed a word, so that no two performances were ever the same. The jongleur was not tied to one master. His master was the audience. He knew how to capture a peasant with humor, how to impress a noble with tales of valor, how to move a weary soldier with songs of home. Like the jester, he gave people what they craved most: release from burden, whether it came through laughter or melody. The court could not do without its fool, for in times of mourning he reminded them of joy, and in times of triumph he reminded them not to take themselves too seriously. The fool was, in a strange way, a mirror for all. His painted face, his wild antics, made visible the things others tried to hide. When a greedy lord devoured meat too quickly, the fool exaggerated the action until the hall laughed. When a knight strutted too proudly, the fool parodied his march, swinging an imaginary sword too large to carry. In these moments, the truth slipped through under the guise of play. Kings might silence counselors, but they tolerated fools, for fools spoke without malice, at least on the surface. But not all jesters were clowns leaping about. Some were sharp-tongued satirists, weaving riddles and clever wordplay that challenged courtiers to think, even as they laughed. They might whisper truths about politics, the church, or corruption, dressing them in puns and rhymes so that those who listened could choose to laugh or reflect. A few even acted as secret messengers, their songs or jokes coated with meanings only certain ears would catch. The role was more complex than many imagined, and though outwardly low in rank, some jesters held more influence than the armored knights seated at the high table. Meanwhile, the jongleur continued his wandering. He found himself at a fair where merchants sold cloth, spices, and trinkets. He stood upon a barrel, strummed his lute, and began to sing of King Arthur and his knights, of quests for holy relics, of maidens in distress. Children gathered first, then adults, then even merchants paused to listen, their hands still on their goods. His voice rose above the clamor, carrying not only entertainment, but wonder, reminding listeners of ideals far greater than their daily lives. He juggled apples for the crowd, then tossed in a verse mocking the high taxes of the region, which drew knowing laughter and even applause. For a moment, the marketplace was not filled with trade and labor, but with unity, bound by one man's performance. Back in the courts, the jester's role was constant yet unpredictable. Some evenings he was the soul of the gathering, lifting spirits when alliances soured or when rumors of war darkened the air. At other times, he was called upon to entertain foreign ambassadors, to demonstrate the wealth of the kingdom by showing not only gold and power, but laughter itself. For what court could be considered truly grand if it lacked the sound of joy? Even the hardest kings, men who swung swords without hesitation, valued their fools. They knew that laughter could soften anger, that jest could disguise truth, that comedy could ease the iron grip of rule. In truth, the jester and the jongleur shared more than performance. Both balanced on the edge of survival, relying on the whims of their audience. Both spoke truths others dared not. Both preserved the human spirit in ways parchment and swords could not. The jongleur carried legends, ensuring they spread across borders and survived in memory, while the jester reflected the court itself, showing rulers their own flaws in ways that stung less because they were wrapped in jest. Their comedy was not trivial, it was essential, a thread binding society in laughter, in music, in shared story. As the night in the hall wore on, the jester grew bolder. He climbed onto the great table, leaping between plates, spilling a goblet of wine deliberately upon his own head, pretending to sob as if the drink had insulted him. He pulled a fish from a platter and held it like a scepter, declaring himself king of the sea. The queen laughed until tears rolled, the lords roared, the knights banged their fists on the table. In that moment, the bonds of rank dissolved. The king himself leaned back, his stern face softened, and for a heartbeat he was no ruler, no commander, no monarch, just a man, laughing. The fool had won again, and in a distant tavern a jongleur finished his song as the crowd clapped, tossing him coins that rang against the wooden floor. He bowed deeply, not as a lord, not as a knight, but as a servant of laughter, of melody, of memory. He would pack his lute and move on at dawn, carrying his songs into another town, where again he would remind strangers of joy and story. Neither fool nor jongleur left behind monuments or carved statues, but their legacies lived in the hearts of those who heard them. Long after the kings had died and the battles had faded from memory, the echoes of their laughter and song would remain. proof that even in times ruled by iron and blood, humanity still craved the simple, eternal gifts of comedy and art.